master of Udayana, known by the name Padmasambhava, is an emanation of Buddha Amitabha, miraculously born from a lotus flower on an ocean isle. Having interrupted birth and death, he remains in his bodily form beyond passing and transmigration. His voice teaches the 9 vehicles, including all the causal and resultant teachings. His mind, endowed with omniscient wisdom, comprehends the vital points of all dharmas. Lady Sogyal, the Princess Karchen, asked this master, "I fail to understand the key points of the outer and inner teachings, the 84,000 dharma doors, and the higher and lower vehicles. So please bestow upon me the vital instructions." She had not only pleased her master in thought, word, and deed, but she also accompanied this request with an offering of a golden mandala bedecked with turquoise, resembling the 7 precious possessions. Lady Sogyal asked the master which vital point contains all that appears and exists. The master replied, "Space is the vital point that contains all that appears and exists. The 4 elements are all changing and impermanent, but from the very beginning, the nature of space is empty and unchanging. The 4 elements, earth, water, fire, and wind, have a fleeting nature. When they appear within the expanse of space. While they remain within the expanse of space. And when they dissolve within that same expanse. Since the nature of space is unchanging throughout the 3 times, all that appears and exists can be condensed into space. While space is the example, the meaning is dharmata, which like space is empty since the primordial beginning. And the sign is that within the sky-like empty mind, habitual tendencies and disturbing emotions are just like clouds and mist. When they appear within empty mind. When they remain within the expanse of empty mind. And when they dissolve within that same expanse of empty mind. When you realize that this is the way it is, to be untainted by the flaws of habitual tendencies for karmic deeds and disturbing emotions, is known as having brought together all that appears and exists within a single vital point. Treasures from Juniper Ridge. The profound treasure instructions of Padmasambhava to the Dakini, Yeshi Sogyal. This is Darren Littlejohn. Welcome to the 12-Step Buddhist Podcast, episode 57, The Stress Response, and continuing with Practices of a Bodhisattva, number 15. If in the middle of a crowd of people, someone reveals your hidden faults and abuses you for them, to see him as a spiritual friend and to bow with respect is the practice of a bodhisattva. So once again, the middle of a crowd of people it's really easy for us now to look at social media and our response to trolls. Anyone who's saying a bunch of negative stuff or trying to insult us, I block those people instantly. Anyone who crosses a line of disrespecting me or someone else. I even had a lifelong friend who, during some, political administration stuff, was kind of mean to a lady that was just a really kind of vulnerable Zen lady. And I was like, bro, I'm sorry, I love you, but you got to go. The thing is, and I don't want to do those kind of things, but there's a line, and that's the line. So I don't allow people to traumatize me or disrespect me, or to traumatize or disrespect anyone else in front of me, whether it's a dog or a horse or a person. So I guess that would be a little bit of a domestic violence Nancy that I would be if I observed something like that. It would be impossible for me not to intervene. So let's just imagine that it's afterwards. I mean, because I'm going to be realistic, I feel like the level of Bodhisattva capacity, at least that I would have to turn around, at least that I've tried to demonstrate or apply, it's not so big, my capacity to do this. So I kind of feel like it would be better to even give myself a break and kind of look at it in retrospect. In other words, okay, now that that's happened, I can see the situation as a teaching moment, we could say, if you want to put it in some kind of marketing, kind of, non-spiritual terms, something like that, a teachable moment, right? So you can do that you can apply that here, right? And so one thing I could explain there in a principle, which is a very interesting point, you can take a conventional concept and you can dharmarize it. Okay, so let's invent that term, DHARMA hyphen RIZE. Is that right? Would that be right? To dharmarize it. So this is what there are many, many, many examples of this. Really, there's sort of the symbolic nature of a lot, if not all. Even in the most obvious teachings, there are many multiple layers and levels. So to turn teachable moment, quote unquote, into a Dharma application would be to apply the practice of a Bodhisattva here to see the situation, whether it is in the past or if you're a Bodhisattva level, or if it's not so intense for you in that moment, and you have the capacity to apply it in that moment. That's awesome. And of course, we can do this to a certain point, but there is a window of tolerance that I have to deal with. So the reality is, what's my actual capacity and where can I practice? Is it reasonable to expect myself to do this perfectly in all times and places? How extraordinary do I expect myself to be? And so forth. But if we look at it in the past a little bit, and it's a super bad one that was kind of hard, and we give ourselves a break, understanding that we do have a window of tolerance, and we do have a stress response system, and that all points are valid, meaning that although it's not an excuse for our bullshit, there isn't, like a real reason, a deep kind of mechanism, that makes sense for that response to happen. And if we start to understand this in the context, and I'm not going to read to you, I wrote about this in the first part of Compassionate Recovery. It's a book in 4 parts, and part 1 is about the brain stuff and how the trauma and the ACEs, the 8 adverse childhood experiences, affect us and contribute to our our addiction rather, and impair us in our recovery. Do you see? And impair us in our recovery is what I'm really trying to say. And I don't want to be, I'm trying to be sensitive of terms, because throughout Compassionate Recovery, I didn't write at all about being broken or that kind of thing, because I don't want to use the shaming language. We've already been shamed enough, and most of us have enough Stockholm Syndrome which is the trauma bonding. We have enough of this to do it to ourselves. I don't need you to beat me up. I already do a great enough job myself. You'll hear in recovery over the years from everywhere that I've ever been, and we all know this. We have the biggest hammer, to clobber ourselves with. And I think a lot of it is that we've adopted it from our perpetrators, who've beaten us. We go, yeah, you're right, I am an asshole, bam, bam. And you're not an asshole really in that moment. You're a child or whatever is going on, and you start to develop that and evolve that. So we want to take these things into consideration when being Dharma practitioners, and I'm going to tell you why. Because if you're in recovery, or if you're a trauma response person in recovery like myself, you go into some Dharma circles and centers, it can be very difficult for people to understand your response to things. I've found this myself. Now, I'm also a triple Gemini with the sun, moon, rising in the house, and 7 planets in the house of Gemini. So I'm like, oh, I can't really land anywhere. But for me, I have the super intense personality. You may not be like that, and you may be on the, you can still have high aces and be in the lower end of that, right? So you can respond by being more passive or shut down and really just more compliant. And I'm really more compulsive and rebellious, deep in the amygdala, right? And we go into detail on this in compassionate recovery in very simple, clear terms so that anyone can understand it, think about it, and talk about it a little bit so that when you apply it to your life, you can understand what's going on with you. It's really, really good to know what's going on with you, because then as you work with your energy in your healing capacity, your depth of wisdom and knowledge about yourself really just increases and unfolds. All right, so you want to keep this idea and attitude evolving. Okay, so the idea of turning something into a bodhisattva practice, of transforming it, whether it's before or after, that's fantastic. Understanding that your response as someone who has high aces or someone with a narrower window of tolerance is something to be understood, and then self-compassion applied to. And we go into detail in all of this in this latest book, but it's not a stick to beat yourself up with, right? And it's there for a reason. And the reasons are, complicated and in depth, but in principle, the reason these situations are very overstimulating for us, which overstimulating means, so think about this as like a waveform, or it's easier to say just 2 lines and then in the middle there's another line. So in front of you just 3 horizontal lines, right? And in the middle is your baseline where you can function and not be over or understimulated. So when you're stimulated, it can trigger you up or down. I guess this is the point that I'm trying to make. So your response to a trigger can be to shut down or to spike up, right? And mine is generally the latter. I'm going to be sharp-toned, and a little bit more, say, defensive than the average person. So it's difficult to kind of psychologically cope with being a Buddhist with all this trauma stuff and addiction stuff going on if we don't have a knowledge and an understanding, which gives us a basis to kind of let go of the shame. Do you know? It's really helpful and actually vital information for me, which is why I spent, over 4 years researching it and writing about it, because it's actually the deepest solution I can find. And, that's applicable to all of us, regardless of, where we are on the spectrum. Okay, so the application to recovery of the understanding of, say, any of the Bodhisattva or any other, Dharma practices, to put it into the context of understanding our ability and our capacity, and to start where you are and to understand effort is progress, not necessarily distance. So if you read 1 page of a Dharma book and really get it, it's a lot more important and effectual in your life than if you read 3 books and just kind of didn't get any of it and couldn't work out any of it in a practical application in daily life. Okay, so we're giving ourselves the opportunity to practice at a level of being where we are, and then to understand that wherever we go from there is the prime opportunity for us. It's acceptable. It's good enough. We start where we are, and like a yoga thing, like any movement forward is enough. Go deeper any amount is what I would say to a student. Go deeper any amount, and you can decide what amount that is. Okay, so what is the stress response and what is the window of tolerance? There's a lot of detail there, and I won't go into terminology on the podcast. You can read that and underline it and understand it that way. But conceptually speaking, our ability to withstand stress because of what happens when we experience toxic stress, or stress that brings us into, let's say, an overload, what we call an allostatic overload, right? So we get into stress that is ongoing, that we can't escape from, all right? So if you're in a situation where you're trapped, say, I don't know, your primary caregiver is an alcoholic and they come home and want to, beat you or molest you or do that to another family member or your mom or something like that, or your dad, or however it works, okay? So, this is an example of living with a toxic stress that occurs over a duration of time. So a lot of people think that PTSD is just one event or something, and that's true for some people. They experience a catastrophic event, but for the rest of us, it's mostly this ongoing stuff with, for me at least, many catastrophic events. I can mark some timelines of my life, the demarcations, the marking points, the definitive moments when I define myself by the fucking beatings that I took, by the what have you. Okay, I won't go off onto a tangent on that. Right? I need a deep breath here. Have one with me. It's all empty. I mean, I don't want to get worked up talking about getting worked up. But we have to understand this if we're to understand ourselves, that the kind of trauma that happens burns our fuses, it burns our circuits in such a way that it actually burns in a stress response, which fires off these stress hormones, which normally mean run, like freeze your thinking and move your ass, right? And that's what the brain and body does in order to escape danger. But if you can't escape danger, it becomes toxic stress. And toxic stress over time becomes a great impairment to our well-being on a physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual levels, which will change the arc and course of our life throughout our entire lifetime. Actually, if we make it further, getting a bit harder to deal with as we get older, from say 40s on. So the effects of some of these things are really, really long-term and long-lasting. And one of the effects is clearly that we get bounced out of our window of tolerance because our stress, our stressor, our response to stress, our mechanism, our firmware that's burned into our circuits from our early experiences and traumas and such, these things are what they are. But we can change our responses. This is a familiar theme in recovery and psychology and so forth. If we get our training in mindfulness, we get our training in self-compassion, we train our minds in compassion. There are practices. They're all laid out in compassionate recovery, and many things are really similar and connected to, in some ways, in principle, to the 12-Step Buddhist and other books and other ideas that you see out there. But this is all coming together in framing into this context that we're trying to understand our stress response, understand ourselves, and understand that we do have a window of tolerance. And sometimes when we spike, we have to have some quick defense behaviors, some escape routes, and some plans, some support, some skills, some techniques. But over time in our recovery, if we develop our capacity for being still and silent, that's our only, that's not our only skill, right? But if we develop that capacity, then we have some space to see when we're moving out of our window of tolerance, or moving into a stress response, be it up or down, or triggered by some things. It brings up the burned in wiring and chemical responses in our brain that happened because we were trapped and stressed and traumatized and in it for a long time that we couldn't escape. All right, and it impaired us in our development. So we have to have self-compassion by understanding this. And what I'm saying is I wrote this book because by understanding it, that's how you have self-compassion. Do you understand? So if you want to know yourself and understand yourself, then go into this and understand it so that you can say, well, that's why. And then you can understand all points are valid. It may not be the best response, and you may not agree with it, and it may be unhealthy and all this. But the the idea is still there, that it's just as if you were in a relationship with someone who was severely disturbed and they were doing crazy stuff, and you're like, all points are valid. I respect your feelings. I respect your point of view. I strongly disagree. For me, it's like this. And then you're using this language to understand, to apply the wisdom, the wise mind, as they would say in DBT, or dialectical behavioral therapy, devised by Marshall Linehan, University of Washington. There's a whole field on it and lots of stuff around it. It's very trauma-based, this borderline, and all this kind of stuff can really split us off and create all kinds of long-term lifetime things, as I mentioned: addiction, personality disorders, bipolar, mental illnesses, heart disease, all these different kinds of things. But what we can do is learn to be compassionate by understanding. We need to understand that this is what's going on. This is why we have this response, and we're not pieces of shit because of it. Right. So you can put your hand on your heart and say, hey, I'm not a piece of shit because of it. I really am trying, you know. Think about the Iraq war vet who beats his wife and hates himself, beats his children, or even say not beating them, let's just say even just being disrespectful and feels shame, or at whatever level of responding as if you're not even yourself, you know, because it's a piece of wiring and it's a piece of circuitry. So we can retame and relearn and retrain our stress response through lots of vigorous exercise, high intensity interval training, deep insight practices, wisdom, teachings, hanging out with a good supportive group, whether it's online or in person. And that's how we do it. Okay? So, love ya. Thanks so much. You can get on with your bad self in terms of trying all this Buddhist stuff and being clean and sober and being in the world and coping with all this stuff here, you know, that we have to deal with in this time frame of what we're currently experiencing. It is truly a difficult time for all of us. But in the teachings, it says that this is what's called the Kali Yuga, which will be the subject of some other discussion. Thanks again for listening. Please pick up Compassionate Recovery for yourself and a friend. Thank you so much. The audiobook is also available. Until next week, peace out and namaste.